This is fundamentally what NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, is here to enable: self-awareness. But in order to understand and appreciate the extent of the opportunity that we have to grow and develop today, it's sometimes useful to understand where it is that we've come from as a human race. Now, what I could do, I could just jump right into the history of NLP, which might be interesting to know for some people, but it's kind of irrelevant to understand if we don't understand the journey that the human race has taken towards this place of enlightenment, where some of the history books claim that we are today, at this point in history. For scores of thousands of years, most human beings saw the world and themselves as being centre to the universe. Now, this obviously takes us back to pastoral societies, where people were God-fearing, nations were God-fearing, God-worshippers. Many people subscribed to religion to varying degrees. And it wasn't until 1543 that Copernicus formulated a model of the universe placing the sun at the centre of the universe rather than the earth. Could you imagine what it would have been like back then? All right. So you've been raised, being read all of the biblical scriptures by your parents, by your community elders, and back then there was no mobile phones, so you couldn't go and check out what Wikipedia has to say about it. You couldn't do a post on Facebook and see what all your pals think or all your friends' opinion is. You're reliant on knowledge and wisdom and insight being passed from one generation to the next. Oh, how we have evolved. Some people might say that we're evolving and moving forward as a human species. Others might say that we're moving backwards. Back then, when communities were tight and strong, I wonder if as many mental health illnesses and conditions and disorders existed. Well, I know for a fact that they didn't, because they hadn't been invented yet. Invented being the operative word. So let's just go on this journey, all right? For thousands of years, most people saw themselves as being the centre of the universe. What do you think would happen to a person's confidence and self-esteem if they were to wake up one morning realising that they actually weren't the centre of the universe? All of these biblical scriptures that say that the human race is made in the image of God and all this kind of thing, well, everything that we would fundamentally believe now comes to question, doesn't it? We're no longer certain anymore. We believed one thing, but now we believe something else. I guess that, being presented with new information like this would send a person into a state of crisis. It would certainly invoke paradigm shifts, wouldn't it? So, in 1606, William Shakespeare first published Macbeth. Now, you might be asking the question, where is this all going? But just stay with me, I promise it's going somewhere. So in 1606, Macbeth was first published, seeing a king killed for the first time on stage. Now, we could actually go back to I think it was 426 AD, all right? And this was when the gospel, I'm giving you a bit of a history lesson here, if that's okay. So the gospel had been taken through Europe from Israel, and various people had accepted. But in the United Kingdom, this was the first time that a king embraced the gospel. Now, before then, we were dealing in pastoral times, so every region had its own king and its own form of governance. But it was when the King of Suffolk, I think it was King Edward the First or the Second, embraced the gospel for the first time, he brought unity into a nation through introducing law, the difference between right and wrong. All right. Before then, in the United Kingdom, we were a bit of a barbaric nation. So that gives you a little bit of context, right? Up until that point, especially up until 1606, kings had always been viewed as the ultimate authority, concrete authority, as it were. All right, whatever a king said went. That was law. That was gospel. Because kings, for all intents and purposes, as determined by popular cultural belief, kings were appointed by God, not by man. Not like politicians, Politicians are different. Politicians are voted in by the general masses. And we know that the general masses always aren't so wise, all right? Because we can have all sorts of cognitive biases coming into play, as we've just looked at. But here, in 1606, Macbeth was first published, seeing King killed for the first time on stage. Could you imagine the public outcry? A king murdered? Killed? Now, I'm not saying this had never been thought of, but it's the first time that this actually became a suggested thing. And as we know with all things, all it takes is one person to go first, and this just so happened to be William Shakespeare. What happened? In 1649, less than 50 years later, a single generation later, Charles I was publicly executed. And it was okay. It was deemed as fine. Why? Because the idea had been culturally embraced through the story of Macbeth. It wasn't a shock when it happened. It was most likely a shock when Copernicus proved that the sun was in fact at the centre of the universe and not the world. But here, we're taking a very different tone to our evolution here. Why? Because we've had a decade of embracing this idea. A king can be killed? Does that mean that kings aren't appointed by God? Because if kings are appointed by God, then surely they can't be killed. But if they can be killed, then that means that they're not appointed by God, which means, well, what's the point in God? Now, I don't know how people's minds work, all right? But you can kind of partially understand how cultural thinking may have evolved in certain parts of the world. So here we go now. In 1688 in England, Parliament deposed a king and installed a new replacement. So here we go now. Kings no longer had the authority that they once had. We were now replacing kingship, authoritarian rule, or monarchical rule with an entirely new model. Parliament, government, prime ministers, presidents, firsts among equals. All right, kind of matching the senates of days of old, Greece and so on and so forth. So here we go now in 1619. Now, obviously, this is a few years, before Charles I was publicly executed. A gentleman named Giulio Vanini was burned at the stake for advocating the Copernican view. He was burned at the stake for agreeing with the Copernican view. Could you imagine what would happen today in your culture if someone was to get publicly executed for just simply disagreeing with your perspective? Or if you were to get publicly executed for disagreeing with someone else's perspective? My goodness, these days, opinion rules, doesn't it? So in 1639, William Crabtree proved the sun to be central in the universe as he observed the passing of Venus over the sun. So now what we have through research and observation is evidence that what Copernicus first suggested was actually accurate. All right. So Copernicus had kind of created a well-informed proposal, kind of like a theory, but now this theory had been studied, it had been researched, it had been observed over time. Now it had been validated, which proved all the theorists correct. Could you imagine how the person who decided that Giulio Vanini was to be executed might have felt, knowing that he was wrong to do so? I wonder if he got sent to prison. Probably not, because times have changed, don't they? In 1632 to 1704, a gentleman named Mr. John Locke, right, a political theorist, influencer back in the day, published The Passions of the Soul, claiming that the body and the soul are not one, that the body and the soul are completely separate entities. All right, now if you think about this, what this one proposal, theory, created was a distinction and a separation between those aspects of the human experience that can only be dealt with through medicinal purposes, and then those aspects of our human experience that can be resolved through conversational, relational processes. Are you with me? Now what we have is we have a medical model and we have a maturity model. A medical model that seeks to fix broken parts within the body once diagnosed, and then we have a maturity, relational model that seeks to understand the human experience and the reasons why people have the turbulences that they have. Now, you might be starting to see where this teaching is going. All right, and this is kind of Enlightenment teaching at its finest, not because I'm the greatest teaching, but linking together ideas, right, so that we can understand how, as a human species, our thinking has evolved. Can you see this? So here we go in Darwin, 1809 to 1882. Darwin proposed that man cometh from monkey. Well, what would lead Darwin to even propose something like this? Disenfranchised, that the human race is no longer the centre of the universe. We're just an orbiting planet around the sun, a big blazing ball of fire that is actually at the centre of the universe. Kings, there's no more value in kings. Kings aren't appointed by God, which might mean that, going back from all these years ago when cultures and communities revolved around godly, scriptural, biblical teaching, governed by laws, by virtuous ways of living, now it's kind of a free-for-all. I think man comes from monkey. Going back 4 million years ago, I think that this happened. So then what happens? A couple of 100 years later, well, let's get to 2020. Now you'll have students debate, man cometh from monkey. It was proven 4,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago. Sorry, who documented that one again? Oh, that's right, no one. So popularity in Darwinism and rationalism increased as people moved away from theistic worldviews. Theistic worldviews incorporated a way of virtuous living, whereas rationalism and Darwinism kind of removed aspects of hope from throughout society. All right? When people have a God they can trust, then it gives them hope in their endeavours, that perhaps someone else might be looking out for them. But when man has cometh from monkey and man must maketh his own way, then man must maketh his own way. Individualism becomes the new modern religion. The problem with individualism is it often leads to isolation, which leads to despair, which leads to depression, which, when linked back to this idea, the body and the soul are one. If a person has an emotional turbulence going on in their physical body, it is to be dealt with by medical processes and methods rather than conversational, relational ones. Now, I'm not proposing any worldview here. All I'm actually doing is just linking together ideas. You come up with whatever conclusion you want to, all right? What I do know, what has led us to where we're at today, is this gentleman, again influenced by others, Wilhelm Wundt, in 1832, noted psychology as a science apart from philosophy. Now, philosophy going back a couple of thousand years ago, when you had your great thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they would ask questions such as, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live a good, virtuous life? Psychology being very, very different from philosophy, psychology seeking to understand human behaviour. All right? So where John Locke, around about 200 years earlier, had said that the body and the soul are not one, Wilhelm Wundt in 1832 began asking questions. What is the relationship between the human experience, human emotion, human thought, human behaviour? How do we function as human beings? What does it mean to be human? Which leads us to answer a huge question that many scholars still debate and argue over. Is psychology an empirical science, or is it not an empirical science? It can't possibly be an empirical science. Why? Because you cannot generalise and group together groups of people from all around the world into labels that just simply tick a box. Every human being on the face of the planet has a unique set of experiences, interpretations, perceptions, perspectives that will either be understood or will be generalized and categorized.